Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you for coming to my talk today titled Negative Affect Models of Substance Use, a Cross-Cultural Examination. My name is Dr. Adrian Bravo. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Psychological Sciences at the College of William & Mary in the state of Virginia in the United States of America. I would first like to thank you all for attending my talk, and I would also like to thank the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba for inviting me to give this talk today. Before I begin, I just want to address some acknowledgments of my funding. First, I'd like to thank the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism here in the United States for help funding on some of my research projects. I'd like to also thank the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health for a recent grant that me and my group got examining mindfulness intervention for combat wounded veterans for the military. And then I'd also like to thank the National Agency for Scientific and Technological Promotion in Argentina for funding a grant with the PI being Doctora Angelina Pilari, and I'm a co-investigator on this research. Before I go and jump into my talk today, I just want to highlight some of my research interests for you all to get to know my research area. So my research interests really falls into three domains. The first is identifying who is most susceptible to the development of substance use and mental health disorders. And I do this across many different populations, including college students, young adults, clinical populations, as well as military veterans. The next area really focuses on identifying under what conditions individuals engage in health risk behaviors that lead to mental health outcomes and problematic substance use. And then finally, I look at identifying what factors may decouple the relationship between health risk factors and health outcomes across distinct populations. And the talk that I'll go over today kind of highlights and actually goes into each of these areas a little bit. So first, I'll provide an overview of what my talk will discuss today. First, I'll talk about different etiological pathways of substance use. I'll really discuss what has been proposed in the literature about what is the common ways in which individuals engage and unfortunately lead to problematic substance use. Next, I'll highlight my research looking at negative affect models of substance use research, particularly looking at it from a cross-cultural lens. And then finally, I'll end with talking about future directions and what my research team and lab is currently doing in trying to investigate further this relationship between negative affect and problematic substance use. So first, we'll talk about different etiological pathways of substance use. So first, I'll kind of highlight what have been proposed pathways in which individuals engage in substance use. So the first is the positive regulation pathway. The second is the pharmacological vulnerability pathway. The third is a deviance proneness pathway. And finally, there's a negative regulation pathway, which will mainly be the bulk of my talk today. But here I want to kind of highlight to you all the different ways in which we've theorized why or how individuals engage in problematic substance use. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the positive regulation pathway. Really, this pathway refers to using a drug to experience positive reinforcement effects. That is because it's fun or because individuals like the feeling when they're high, or in case you're using marijuana or any other kind of drug. Really, you can think of this as when celebratory kind of enjoyment. And so it really, with regards to the substance use literature, there's different motives or motivations for why individuals decide to take a drug or use a drug. In this case, with the positive regulation pathway, it's really associated to this idea of enhancement, drinking motives or enhancement marijuana motives or any type of drug use. Really the idea being that we're really just trying to elevate the positive mood that we're already in. So we're just trying to enhance the experience that we're currently living in or engaging in. The next pathway is called the deviance proneness pathway. The idea here is that substance use is really viewed as part of a more general deviant kind of pattern rooted in earlier developmental stages. So the focus here is risk factors from young developmental stage and how that can have a role in creating susceptibility to problematic substance use. So here you can think of substance use as related to parental alcohol or drug use, child maltreatment, family conflict, permissive parenting styles, affiliation with deviant peers, and different externalizing problems. I would like to say that a lot of the research has focused on parental aspects, particularly parenting, but also genetic factors as well. And then there's a lot of research looking in adolescence among peer relationships. And a lot of research has indicated that individuals, if your peer group is high, engages in substance use, then you're more likely to also engage in substance use. The third vulnerability pathway that we'll talk about is this pharmacological pathway. So really, it argues that individuals differ in their response to the acute effects of taking drugs. and that these individuals are etiologically relevant. These differences among each of us makes it relevant for who is more likely to engage or at least succumb to problematic substance use. So in this case, some individuals are at risk for drug use misuse because they're especially sensitive to reinforcement, either positive or negative, and are therefore more likely to use drugs because they get comparatively greater effect from it. The fourth pathway, which is again what I will focus on predominantly within my talk, is this negative regulation pathway. Really, it refers to using a drug to diminish any negative affect states like anxiety or depression. So when you're thinking about with regards to the alcohol coping, drinking motives, you can think of this as a way to regulate your negative affect, and you're engaging in drinking due to coping reasons. So you're motivated for coping resources or trying to alleviate the negative affect you might be dealing with. This is also known in literature as the self-medication hypothesis or the tension reduction hypothesis. And again, the bulk of my talk will go deeper into this negative regulation pathway. But first, I kind of want to highlight some of the cross-cultural research that we've done in testing each of these etiological pathways to talk about the universality of these pathways. So why do we need cross-cultural research? Well, for one, poor mental health and problematic substance use is a global issue. It is not only concentrated within one area, one locality, one province, one state, one country. There's a global issue that we're dealing with, particularly among young adults. So my talk today will really focus on my research among young adults, particularly because at that developmental period between roughly 18 to 25, there are so many new nuances, at least within the United States, where these young children are now growing into adulthood, and there's added stressors with that transition. And unfortunately, within this age group, there's a lot of research indicating that this is one of the most high-risk groups for development of poor mental health and particularly problematic substance use. The other one is, particularly for this talk, is are these etiological pathways that have been discussed in literature universal or are they culturally specific? Is there something going on within each particular culture that either predisposes individuals to be more likely affected by each of these pathways? Or are these pathways pretty good at explaining how people develop substance misuse across individuals from different cultures or nations? So first, I'd like to talk to you about the cross-cultural addiction study team. So this is a research team that I created about 4 years ago now. And really, CAST is a collective of international scientists with a shared goal of answering meaningful research questions regarding addictive behaviors. Here, we'll predominantly talk about substance use. At the end, I will talk about other kind of addictive behaviors that we are investigating. Really, the goal for our research is to understand or answer research questions that have important global policy, prevention, and/or treatment implications. So this is the current team. Within the US, we usually collect data within, and again, this team so far has really focused on young adults, particularly college students in our data collection. So most of all the research is from individuals who work in academia at certain universities across the world. So our current team is made up of individuals from the US. And so we collect research in 4 different states across the US: Virginia, New Mexico, Colorado, and New York. The really nice part is, especially when we're investigating marijuana-related research, it's pretty diverse in the legality policies across the different states. So we can focus in within the United States and look at differences across states. But again, most of my research really focuses on the cross-national differences. My group in Spain, they are located in the Universidad de Jaime. I hope many of you are familiar. If not, you should become familiar with Dr. Angelina Pilari, who is a great colleague, and we've worked a lot together on various projects. And so she is our PI for Argentina. Our colleague, and we have researchers in England, South Africa, Netherlands, Uruguay, and Canada. So really, over time, I've developed this team by just bringing on scientists who are really interested and passionate of better understanding what leads individuals, particularly young adults, to experience poor mental health and particularly engage in problematic substance use. So I first want to address this study that we wanted to look at these etiological pathways. So here you'll find an article publication that we did on our very first project. And the goal of this study was really wanting to understand, does these different personality pathways work, or are they predictive of problematic substance use among college students? And more importantly, is these pathways universals in the sense of, are the relationships that we find within our model consistent among individuals across different countries? So for this study, we collected data among college students in 3 countries. So this was our first ever study. So we collected data in college students in Argentina, Spain, and within the US. And really the goal was to kind of look if we can tell if certain personality factors were associated with certain alcohol related outcomes via different types of mediators. Again, really these ones testing different pathways. Now, I will say the only pathway we weren't able to test was the psychopharmacological pathway. But here in this study, we really wanted to test the other 3 pathways: the deviance proneness pathway, the positive affect, and the negative affect. So here we have a variable of emotional stability, which is just reverse coded. If you can think of neuroticism and being predisposed to negative affect, this is the polar opposite, where you can handle negative affect pretty well. And the idea is that individuals who are high in emotional stability should report lower coping mechanism or motives for drinking, which would lead to lower alcohol use and consequences, which would show some support for the negative affect models of substance use. Then we wanted to look at extroversion as particularly a predictor of enhancement and looking at its associations with alcohol. The idea here really looking at this positive affect regulation pathway. And then finally, we wanted to look at this idea of antisocial behavior. Again, the deviance proneness pathway, there's an argument that individuals as they're growing up really have some antisocial behavior, and that's what predisposes them for problematic substance use. And so here we examine particularly conscientiousness and agreeableness as predictors of substance use, particularly alcohol in this case, via antisocial behavior. So overall, we found support for all 3 of these pathways. And that really highlights the idea that while we talk about the different pathways predicting alcohol outcomes in different ways, they are not mutually exclusive. And they can all play a role in the development or misuse of a substance for an individual. So here, what we really found is, as you can tell here, that conscientiousness and agreeableness were associated with lower antisocial behavior, which was associated with more consequences and more use. So in other words, really support for this deviance proneness pathway. We did find support for the positive affect pathway in the sense that extroversion was positively associated with enhancement motives, which was associated with more substance use. And then finally, looking at the emotional stability, we see that individuals higher in emotional stability are associated with less drinking to cope, which is associated with lower alcohol consequences. So in another way to think about it is individuals who report higher neuroticism are associated with endorsing drinking to cope motives higher than other students. And that in turn, that's associated with more alcohol use and consequences among these individuals. Now, when we ran these analyses, we actually looked at it in the total sample of all the students without taking into account the cross-national differences. To test for the universality of our findings, what we did really is actually constrain statistically every path to be equivalent among the students from each country. And we tested the model, fitted the model to see if we forced each of these pathways to be roughly equal across each student from the different countries, does that explain the data well? What we actually found was it didn't. So we had to investigate what exactly is going on, what's different, what pathway is different between college students in the 3 different countries. And what we actually ended up finding is really it's this pathway between agreeableness and antisocial behavior, particularly that it was stronger among American students or students from the US compared to students in Spain or Argentina. So here I'll highlight quickly kind of the overall message behind this. So really what we looked at this cross-cultural study or cross-cultural examination of pathways, we really did find the majority of it was universal. However, we did find that one difference, particularly in the relationship between agreeableness and antisocial behavior. One possible explanation, at least, is that there are differences in alcohol legality, legal age for consumption between the US and Argentina and Spain. In Argentina and Spain, the legal drinking age is 18, while in the US is 21. So engaging in substance use at an earlier age within the US is more deviant behavior compared to Argentina and Spain. Another aspect would be that buying alcohol might be less normative and more deviant for participants in the US. Again, the majority of college students are underage based on the legal drinking age here in the United States. So arguably, unless you're recruiting individuals above 21, everyone's engaging in a deviant behavior if they're using alcohol. And again, compared to those from Argentina and Spain. But overall, we really did find that there are these risky personality pathways for alcohol use and alcohol-related problems, and it really could be generalized across gender groups and cultures and really among young adults, particularly college students. Now, one of the findings that I really am passionate about is this idea of the negative affect models or the negative affect pathway. So again, just in a quick summarization, the idea is that you experience some form of negative affect. And by experiencing that, it leads you to engage in substance use because you are motivated to use a substance as a coping mechanism. And that, unfortunately, leads to more problematic use, as, not only in the quantity of use, but also related problems associated with that use. So first, I'll highlight some research kind of supporting this model, not only in comparing one drug or within one drug, but also looking at is this model good at explaining why some individuals engage in multiple drugs, particularly in the literature lately. There's been a huge focus on this idea of concurrent use or even simultaneous use of multiple drugs, simultaneous indicating that you use both drugs during the same use session to enhance the effects. A lot of the research is really focused on alcohol and marijuana. Why do students or young adults engage in both? Why are they mixing both? And so in this study that we did not too long ago, we really wanted to look at this role of social anxiety predicting both alcohol and marijuana outcomes via motives, particularly drinking to cope motives or using marijuana for coping motives within a large population of American students. So in this study, we actually collected data from 2,034 students across about 10 different universities. And really, we wanted to test this model of, does social anxiety relate to both alcohol-related problems and marijuana-related problems among individuals who use both? Or is it potentially that there's different pathways for concurrent users and why they choose to drink alcohol versus why they choose to engage and use marijuana? What we actually found was a large support for this negative affect models. As you can see here, social anxiety was associated with endorsing drinking to cope for anxiety motives, which in turn was associated with more alcohol-related problems. We also found a similar finding for marijuana, such that social anxiety was associated with higher coping motives for engaging in marijuana use, which in turn was associated with problems. And I need to highlight that this finding was above and beyond controlling for how much these students were using alcohol or using marijuana. So beyond just how much you drink or how much marijuana you're consuming, there is a strong relationship between, in this case, social anxiety and alcohol-related problems or marijuana-related problems via drinking to cope for anxiety motives. And what's really important here is it highlights the fact this mechanism of using substances as a coping mechanism as a target for us for intervention purposes. Even for these college students who are admitted to using both alcohol and marijuana in the last 30 days, sometimes simultaneously, it seems when they're dealing with social anxiety, they're really engaging with both to alleviate that negative affect, or in this case, their anxiety related to social experiences. So that kind of highlights how there is a strong support in the literature with this model, that there is a lot of literature within specific substances and across the mixing of different substances of this pathway or these negative affect models. The question now is there specificity across negative affect? In other words, as you saw in the previous slide, we assess drinking to cope for anxiety reasons. One question that we need to understand is, well, do we use substances to cope for a specific affect? Or is it that we just simply use it to feel better? In the literature, there was a line of research that was arguing, no, we really should delineate between the different types of affects. And so we can get a little more detailed or ingrained in how we can intercede from an intervention standpoint. And so in that line of literature, they argued that we can break up drinking to cope motives into drinking to cope for depressive symptoms and drinking to cope for anxiety. At that time, our research team really wanted to understand this further, particularly in talking about the methodological approaches to understanding these negative affect models. From a personal standpoint, we agreed with the proposals from other researchers that perhaps people can really delineate why they're engaging in substance use for coping motives. Is it really because they're angry, sad, upset, depressed, or any other kind of affect that they're dealing with? And I still believe that that could be the case. However, in this study, we wanted to argue that it definitely depends on the methodology that you do. So in this study, we wanted to show that when you're talking about cross-sectional, again, collecting data at one time point where you can't really establish causality, and you're asking people to reflect over at least 30 days their substance use and their motivations for substance use and their affect, can really people delineate, in this case, college students, between why they engage in drinking and cope across the different levels of affect. So as you can see here, we really tested 4 different models to test this question. And the first, we examined whether anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms predict drinking and cope for anxiety motives. And does that relate to problems? If we're talking about specificity, then arguably only drinking and cope anxiety motives should mediate the relationship between anxiety symptoms and alcohol-related problems. We next tested a second model where we kind of did the same thing, but we wanted to look at depressive symptoms. Really, and again, testing this, the idea being that depressive symptoms should relate to alcohol-related problems via drinking and cope for depression motives, but it shouldn't mediate the relationship from anxiety symptoms to alcohol-related problems. In our third model, we created a latent factor of drinking and cope motives, a global affect of drinking and cope motivation. The idea that people just drink for just because they feel bad or because they have negative affect. And again, we tested whether both types of symptoms predicted this global factor, which would lead to more alcohol-related problems. And then we tested actually a fourth model in where we wanted to look at cross effects and interactions to see if there could be a better level of detail to understanding how these mechanisms work. Is it that anxiety symptoms does relate to problems via anxiety motives, but also that depressive symptoms can lead through those drinking and cope for anxiety as well? And what we actually found was that we found support for all 4 models. So in every model, there was mediation effects for each pathway. And what we really found when we looked at, well, which one of these mediators or models explained the most variability in alcohol-related problems or the most variance, we actually found that model 3 explained the majority of the variance. And in that paper, we discussed that, we argued that at least from a cross-sectional standpoint, when you're asking people to retrospectively discuss their motivations, their affect, their substance use outcomes, it really isn't that helpful to just start parsing out why individuals are drinking and cope. However, we do talk about in further research and using a different methodological approach, particularly using daily diary or ecological momentary assessment as a better way, a more sound methodological approach to really get into the fine-grained details of what's occurring in a moment. The nuance and the nice part about this is we can really start examining what is occurring right before you're about to use. Throughout the day, if you're using an EMA or context, you get random assessments throughout the day. With that, we can really truly map out the fluctuations that you have in your affect, and does that associate with your motivation to engage in a substance? And because you're only asking them within the last few hours, it's really much easier for people to highlight why they're drinking the coke. Is it because they're sad? Is it because they're anxious? Is it because they're angry? And those kind of studies, I think, will be, and there is a lot of research coming out more recently that really shows the nuance and how these type of methodological approaches will help us better understand these negative affect models. So now we're diving deeper into this model and really exploring it in a different way. So first, we wanted to look at the specificity of the model with regards to different types of negative affect. The next kind of line of research that we're asking is, why? Why is it that somehow just negative affect leads someone to engage in coping motives or using alcohol or marijuana as a coping motive? We all experience sadness and anxiety at some points in our life. But why is it that some people think or use substances as their primary coping repertoire? So a lot of the research that we've done is looking at cognitive factors that might mediate the relationship between negative affect and substance use coping motives. And today I'll talk about rumination as one of those factors. So again, social learning models posit that cognitions may be a clinical pathway by which more distal psychosocial influences, such as negative affect, may exert its influences on substance use outcomes. Relevant cognitions, including affect content cognitions, like rumination, may ameliorate this affect, which would lead to a sequenced fashion to substance use outcomes. Really, it leads to this idea that perhaps it's not that just people feel bad and they instantly use a substance to cope, but there's something going on cognitively between the time they experience the affect and their engagement in a substance or their increase in motivation to use that substance. So first, I'll talk a little bit overview about rumination. One of the leading theories for rumination or ruminative thinking is called response styles theory. and really defines rumination as a coping response to negative mood involving self-focused attention characterized by repetitive and passive focus on negative emotions. Within the theory, it posits that rumination, A, enhances negative thinking. So individuals who are already dealing with poor negative or a lot of negative affect, if they're high in rumination, they really enhance that negative thinking and really just focus in on that negative affect. It also impairs problem solving. So while individuals who tend to be more ruminative, they might not engage in accurate coping skills, which, as you'll see in the next slide, really kind of leans into this idea that it might mediate the relationship between negative affect and drinking and coke. It also interferes with instrumental behavior. A lot of research shows that using substances as your primary coping repertoire is a high risk factor for you developing a substance use disorder. So in this case, if for individuals who are highly ruminative, they might not engage in something that's actually instrumental for them reducing their affect. And it also tends to erode social support, which we understand that as individuals deal with negative affect, if they feel like they can't get help from anyone else, they might turn to a substance to be able to alleviate that negative affect, even for that short window of time. So this really kind of guides this idea that rumination might explain this relationship. And in an article, CCyP and colleagues argued that it is possible that individuals may drink in order to interrupt the repetitive, obsessive thoughts, which exacerbate and prolong negative moods, rather than simply drinking due to that affective state itself. So this really guided my research to thinking, okay, well, yes, we are proposing this idea that it's not just that you feel bad, that and automatically their first response is to use a substance to deal with it. It might be that it's particularly manifest because there's individuals who are engaging in ruminative thinking, and that consistent repetitive thinking of your affect forces you to say, okay, I need to act. I need to do something about it now. And unfortunately for some individuals, their first act is engaging in substance use because they feel they're motivated to think that it will help alleviate that affect. So before I jump into the research showing this support or testing of this model, I want to briefly talk about 4 rumination facets that I predominantly assess within my research. Again, rumination is a multifaceted kind of construct, and while there's differing measures out there, I really like a certain measure that breaks down rumination to 4 distinct facets. The first facet is called problem-focused thoughts. Really is that idea that you're focusing in on this affect as a problem, and you can't handle it or you can't deal with it in a certain way. So you understand the severity of what you're dealing with, but you don't have a proper coping response to deal with it. And so you just can't constantly reflect on it. The second one is counterfactual thinking. So it's when you ruminate on something that actually didn't occur. A good example is I could be ruminating on the fact that you are all noticing a stain on my shirt. By the way, I don't have a stain on my shirt. But for individuals who engage in this ruminative thinking, they start perceiving things that may have not even occurred. Repetitive thoughts is the third facet, and this is what most consistent with response styles theory of what you think of rumination to be. Finally, there's anticipatory thoughts, future-oriented rumination. You can think of this as someone who may have a date with another person that evening, and they worry and ruminate on the fact that they're going to spill something on their shirt. Again, the event hasn't occurred, but they're already ruminating on a negative outcome. And the reason I like using these 4 facets, because they really start parsing out rumination into different time periods, if you think of it that way, but also different aspects of rumination. And the question in our research was understanding through which of these rumination facets does negative affect really relate to coping motives. We hypothesized that, yes, negative affect relate to all these 4 types of rumination. But the question is, which would be the strongest link to engagement in substance use via engagement or higher motivation to use substances to deal with their negative affect. So one of the first studies we did was we wanted to test that original premise by CCyP and our colleagues, the idea that ruminative thinking, that individuals might drink or use alcohol as a coping mechanism because they're really not focusing on the negative affect, they're just tired of the constant rumination of it. And so in this study, we assessed college students in the US and really wanted to look at whether the relationship between depressive symptoms, drinking a coke, and alcohol outcomes was mediated through rumination. So here you can see our model in which we tested whether depressive symptoms related to alcohol problems via these 4 rumination facets and drinking a coke motives. What we largely found as of all By the way, depressive symptoms did predict all the 4 rumination facets. But what we found is of the rumination facets, problem-focused thoughts was the key mediator of linking depressive symptoms to drinking and cope motives. So what we found is depressive symptoms was associated with more alcohol-related problems via higher endorsement of problem-focused thoughts, which in turn was associated with higher coping, drinking and cope motives. Now, again, I mentioned early on that a lot of my research focuses on cross-cultural examination of these models. So in our first study, which I showed you from our international team, which I showed you how we tested different personality-related etiological pathways to substance use. Here in the next study I'll talk about, we really wanted to replicate what we just found in the previous study and look at it and examine it cross-culturally to test whether these models are universal or culturally specific. So in this study, we wanted to look at whether depressive symptoms, ruminative thinking, and drinking motives, and alcohol outcomes, and really test whether that mediation model that we found among American students replicated across college students for 3 countries. So once again, we collected data among college students in Argentina, Spain, and the US. Interestingly enough, when we did it cross-culturally, we did find again that depressive symptoms was associated to rumination facets. However, no rumination facet was uniquely associated to drinking and cope motives. Again, the effects were fairly weak. So that led us to wonder, okay, well, maybe it might not be as fine detail, but is it still that rumination mediates this relationship? So we tested a different model in which we did a global score of ruminative thinking and collapsed all the 4 rumination facets together. And what we found is support for these negative affect models. We found that depressive symptoms was associated with higher ruminative thinking, and which was in turn associated with drinking and cope, which in turn was associated with alcohol use and alcohol-related consequences. Now, something important was, okay, great. In the total sample, we found support for this model. The question was it universally specific or universal? And what we actually found after constraining every pathway and testing the model fit across college students in these different countries, we actually found support for our findings to be universal. In other words, the strength of the relationship between depressive symptoms to alcohol outcomes via ruminative thinking and drinking and cope was consistent across the college students from the 3 countries. Now, most of the talk today has so far focused on alcohol. Recently, in our second study, we wanted to examine a lot of these models, but focused on marijuana. So in this study, we wanted to replicate what we have found for alcohol and determine whether it's only, because a lot of the research on these models tend to focus on alcohol. There's been a big push, mainly because of the increase in legality in the United States of recreational marijuana, to understand whether our previous models that we really have developed through alcohol research also corresponds to marijuana outcomes. So in this second study, we actually collected data from college students for 5 countries. So in this study, we collected data from the Netherlands, Spain, Uruguay, Argentina, and the United States. And what was really unique at this study was that at the time, Uruguay was the only nation in the world who had legal recreational marijuana, at least from a state or national policy. So in this study, we really tried to approach it with a similar modeling approach we've done for the previous studies, but now focusing on marijuana and using marijuana coping motives as the mediator, along with ruminative thinking. And what we largely found is actually that this time, the relationship between depressive symptoms through marijuana outcomes was mediated particularly through problem-focused thoughts, particularly because individuals who were higher in depressive symptoms reported higher problem-focused thought, and in turn reported higher coping motives, which in turn was associated with more marijuana use and more marijuana-related consequences. Once again, we wanted to test whether this model was universal or culturally specific. And surprising to us, we once again found support for the universality of this pathway or these negative affect models. Again, we constrained every pathway to be equal among the college students in these different countries. And we found, again, that when we constrained those pathways, the model fit didn't detract so much. So again, really touching upon this idea that ruminative thinking might be a key mechanism linking negative affect to drinking a cope or coping motives for substance use, which in turn leads to more problematic substance use. So overall, in summarizing all these studies, what we really found is that primary prevention efforts may benefit from a focus on screening for the identification of young adults with elevated negative affect symptoms, and also individuals who are high in ruminative thinking, particularly those students who are high in problem-focused thoughts. Another aspect is that cognitive variables have been successfully targeted in some interventions to facilitate successful substance use outcomes. So this really guided the next part of our line of research. Can we intercede? Here I've avoided to include rumination yet because this is where I'll talk about future directions and what we're currently doing. But I first want to highlight looking into, can we intercede on this model? Now, there's two areas that we can intercede. The first is in this relationship. While we understand that naturally there are going to be people who deal with negative affect and unfortunately use substances as a way to cope with it, can we stop the relationship or at least dampen the relationship between engaging in that substance use for coping motivated reasons and problems? So a lot of, I won't talk about it today, but feel free to contact me. I do a lot of research on something called protective behavioral strategies of substance use. Really, they're just strategies or behavioral strategies that individuals can engage in before, during, or after substance use to really reduce harm related with that substance use. So if you take alcohol, PBS, for example, you can think of, at least in the United States, it's less common in other countries because you have much better public transportation, but the idea of having a designated driver, someone who remains, who does not drink alcohol and is designated to be the driver for everyone. Another one could be alternating water and alcohol, knowing where your drinks are at all time, being around friends, not mixing alcohol with other drugs. So these are some of the examples. And in that line of research, we have shown that PBS mediates and moderates the relationship between coping motives and substance use problems, such that it dampens that relationship. But today, I'll really focus on, can we intercede the relationship between negative affect and substance use coping motives? In the previous slide, I mentioned that if we can target these cognitive variables, are there positive or more adaptive coping skills that we can engage the students with or the young adult? So even when they experience negative affect, can they do a better or more adaptive coping response as opposed to just engaging in substance use? So while there's many avenues people can take this, I'm going to talk about my research in mindfulness and trying to examine this. So briefly, mindfulness is an umbrella term used to characterize a large number of practices, processes, and characteristics largely find relation to the capacities of attention, awareness, memory retention, and acceptance and discernment. We can have a whole conversation about whether mindfulness is a trait, a state, do you really have to practice it or not? But largely the field really, one consistent definition that a lot of people use is this idea that mindfulness is really the awareness that comes from paying attention to present moment experience in a purposeful and non-judgmental manner. Here, I want to highlight how this could compare against rumination. Here is, while you can still be aware of what's going on in the stimuli you're experiencing, in this case, negative affect, the key aspect is to have and do so in the present moment in a purposeful and non-judgmental manner. With rumination, it tends to be associated with negative thinking or negative thoughts around the negative affect. Here, with mindfulness, the goal is to just understand that you're dealing with the emotions and write it out in a sense and not feel bad because you're experiencing these emotions. So within looking at mindfulness, one of the first studies I wanted to do was look at, well, does at least trait mindfulness moderate the relationship between negative affect and drinking to cope, and does that relate to alcohol outcomes? So in this study, we wanted to look at whether depressive symptoms and alcohol-related problems, and we wanted to test this moderated mediation model of mindfulness and drinking to cope. And so this is really what the model looked like. So if you can imagine, we did test the mediation model. So again, depressive symptoms was associated with drinking to cope, which was associated with alcohol-related problems. What we wanted to test was, does mindfulness dampen the relationship between depressive symptoms and drinking to cope? And what we found is that for students who reported higher mindfulness or trait-like mindfulness, they reported a dampening or at least a weaker relationship between depressive symptoms and drinking to cope, which led to less alcohol-related problems. So in other words, the relationship between depressive symptoms to alcohol-related problems via drinking to cope was weakened among individuals with higher mindfulness. Now, that was one study, and when we looked at it from a cross-sectional trait-like perspective. When I was in my doctoral candidacy, my dissertation actually wanted to test this further. Can we actually get students to engage into a mindfulness meditation? And does that quick 8-minute mindfulness meditation reduce craving in the moment, particularly for individuals who are high in drinking to cope? So in that study, it was an experimental study in which I gave the students different measures of mood and assessed their drinking to cope motivation. Then I randomized them into 3 different conditions in which I gave them a video clip that was supposed to elicit either a sad mood, an anxious mood, or no mood or a neutral mood. After the mood conditions, all of them worked, by the way. Luckily, I assessed them on their affect and their craving at the time. Then they were randomized into 2 conditions. One that was a mindfulness condition where they listen to an 8-minute guided mindfulness meditation, and then the control condition where they listen to some documentary for 8 minutes as well. And then they again were all assessed at the end. Now, unfortunately, I didn't find interaction effects with drinking a Coke. But what I did find was that for the students who were in the mindfulness condition, their craving reduced after the negative affect condition and post the mindfulness condition. So in other words, before the mindfulness condition and after mindfulness reduced their craving in the moment. So it seems like at least mindfulness from an experimental standpoint could intercede in the relationship between negative affect and craving. The next question is, can we do much more with that? And so that leads to our current future directions. So the international team that we conducted a 3rd study in which we called the cross-cultural addictive behavior study. And it examines young adult substance use habits, co-use of various drugs and outcomes. And now we've extended it to other countries, including US, Argentina, Canada, England, Uruguay, Spain, and South Africa. And the nice part about this study is we're actually assessing mindfulness and actually assessing other mindfulness-related constructs like self-regulation, emotion regulation, again, and delayed gratification, distress tolerance. Again, looking at other cognitive factors that might intercede in the relationship between negative affect and substance use coping mechanisms, which hopefully will reduce their substance use. And the nuance is, beyond just substance use, we also collected data on other addictive behaviors like internet addiction, gaming addiction, gambling. Could the etiological model, is it that you feel bad, you want to kind of get yourself away from that mentality, and so you're motivated to engage in gambling or using the internet to kind of escape from your negative affect? And once again, can rumination mediate that relationship? Can mindfulness intercede on that relationship? And so we're actually just finished data collection, and we're starting to examine these questions now. The other study I want to highlight that we're currently doing is called Project Breath Counting. So this kind of builds on from my dissertation study, and working with a colleague who's part of the CAST team, Lee Hogarth in England, we're actually ran last in the fall of 2020 or fall 2019, this study called the Project Breath Counting. And really the purpose was to experimentally test whether mindfulness breath counting versus just general counting protects against stress-induced alcohol seeking, and whether trait or state mindfulness moderate or mediate the role to help isolate the therapeutic mechanisms. The idea being here is it truly mindfulness meditation that's working, or is it simply a distraction that helps people alleviate their engagement in substance use because it reduces their motivation to engage in it, particularly as well as their craving? So this is a cross-cultural experimental study which we just completed, and we're currently running the analyses to test it out. I'd like to thank you all for attending my talk. These are some photos from my university, and I'll gladly take any questions. Thank you.